I died loving a man who never saw me. And when I returned, the imposter who stole my name was already ready to marry him. I died loving a blind man. When I woke, it was the day they'd replaced me. Trigger warning. This story includes references to self-harm and coercion. If you are affected by these topics, please take care and consider stepping away. There are smells that claim a room long after bodies and furniture have left. That morning, the flat remembered me by way of soap and sunflowers. The vase on the kitchen table leaned as if in a private conversation with the light. 7 bright heads nodded toward the window, their faces the exact tired yellow of the tea I used to sweeten for him. The soap, an old bar with a soft lemon edge, sat on the basin where my wrists had learned to dampen and dry. It carried the memory of my mornings, a small domestic liturgy. Underneath, in the seam of the coat hanging by the door, was tobacco, the dry, familiar smell that belonged to Mr. Glenn and had once been only an accent in our house. It made the air taste like a stairwell between 2 rooms. My wrist bore a pale imprint I could not scrub away, a half moon where a bracelet used to be, the lapis bead a constant in my hands for 5 years. I touched that hollow and remembered the weight of it, how the bead caught the light like a small confession. The bracelet was gone. So was I, if the world's quick eyes and the Glenn's louder voices were to be believed. They had replaced me with a younger woman in a dress that cost more than the table where we ate. Juliet wore the role the way a practiced actress wears a mask. Calm, luminous, a body trained to complement the architecture of wealth. She smiled the way people who do not need to account for their hands smiling do, without the small tremor I recognized in Arthur's grin when he was suddenly unable to tell a joke was mean. People handed her our life in careful increments. Photographs were reframed. Invitations arrived addressed to Juliet and Arthur. The housekeeper's schedule shifted. My name, which had been sewn into drawers and cups and Sunday routines, began to fray at the edges. It should have been impossible to feel invisible in a house we had built together. But erasure is not dramatic. It is a series of small adjustments, a sanding away. They taught Arthur a new shape of presence, a company of doctors who suggested rest, family friends who mentioned concerned follow-ups, and the gentle insistence that change was for his comfort. They used that language, comfort, safety, protection, as if he needed shelter from a world that had loved him in the wrong way. Arthur, who had learned to measure the world by sound and touch, began to accept the new chorus. His trust, which had once been reserved for my hands, shifted toward those who came with credentials and voices that matched the Glenn's. They had replaced me with a younger woman in a dress that cost more than the table where we ate. Juliet wore the role the way a practiced actress wears a mask, calm, luminous, a body trained to complement the architecture of wealth. She smiled the way people who do not need to account for their hands smiling do, without the small tremor I recognized in Arthur's grin when he was suddenly unable to tell a joke was mean. People handed her our life in careful increments. Photographs were reframed. Invitations arrived addressed to Juliet and Arthur. The housekeeper's schedule shifted. My name, which had been sewn into drawers and cups and Sunday routines, began to fray at the edges. It should have been impossible to feel invisible in a house we had built together. But erasure is not dramatic. It is a series of small adjustments, a sanding away. They taught Arthur a new shape of presence, a company of doctors who suggested rest, family friends who mentioned concerned follow-ups, and the gentle insistence that change was for his comfort. They used that language, comfort, safety, protection, as if he needed shelter from a world that had loved him in the wrong way. Arthur, who had learned to measure the world by sound and touch, began to accept the new chorus. His trust, which had once been reserved for my hands, shifted toward those who came with credentials and voices that matched the Glenn's. I remember the way his fingertips used to find the same book on the bedside table because he had learned my habit of leaving it there when I fell asleep first. I remember how he would tilt his face to my voice because, sightless or not, he had a way of reading me precisely. Those small domestic habits became evidence later, little signatures of a life that someone assumed could be unstitched and restitched without harm. The morning I woke, my first thought was not of anger. It was of inventory. The human body develops a bureaucracy of attention in danger. Check the breath, the pressure behind the eyes, the taste at the back of the throat. I cataloged what could be fixed, what could be proof. The imprint on my wrist, the smell of soap, the memory of the lapis bead. These were not mere comforts. They were markers, witnesses to the fact that I had been here. If you want to hear the whole plan, stay with me and subscribe. It would be easier to tell the story as a single violent act, as something that snapped and severed. That would be cleaner. But theirs was a methodical thing. The Glenn's work is patience disguised as benevolence. They moved in with the polite cruelty of trustees. At first, their involvement took the shape of concern: a carriage for appointments, late-night calls about fragile nerves, the donation of books with gold lettering. They gave Arthur new routines and replaced my explanations with those of specialists. They explained me away until there was nothing left to explain. Juliet came on evenly wrapped platters, a laugh that folded to the perfect frequency when Arthur smiled, a hand that learned the right way to settle on his forearm. She was not simply the villain in this arrangement, she was a product of it. There were times I watched her from a corridor and saw a child learning how to survive in a system that rewarded compliance. She was privileged in the way that privileges teach the body to expect things. That did not make her harmless. No one who benefits from another's erasure remains untouched by culpability. But she was also young and anxious in ways that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the expectations of a family that could imagine a life as a layout to be planned. People ask me later why I did not tear into the Glens the moment I noticed the first missing fork. The answer is both ordinary and stubborn, because I loved him. Love, in the small details of a shared life, has a terrible inertia. It teaches you to believe slight explanations, to trust a hand that steadies you when the world seems off-kilter. 5 years of mornings made my loyalty procedural. The same hands that rearranged the world for Arthur rearranged the narrative about me. In the space they created, my strong voice sounded like the clatter of a spoon against a cup. There was a day in late summer when something slipped, or was pushed, beyond the realm of suggestion. We were walking by the river, the city bright and heavy and humid. Arthur liked that stretch. The lights on the water made a path he could navigate with knowing steps. He loved the river because it spoke like a clock, the long, patient voice of tides. I remember how he laughed that afternoon at a joke that took me 3 tries to tell because the water made us fond of old stories. There were men on the walkway. Mr. Glenn was there, large and deliberately solicitous. Conversations folded like napkins. The evening blurred between polite apologies and hands that obstructed. What happened at the river is not for sensational retelling. I will say only this: I did not drown by choice. I was taken to a place that the world would later call an accident, and then an evacuation. I remember cold water like a sheet pressed to my lungs, the sensation of being moved as if I were a parcel, the loss of my bracelet in a way that made the hollow on my wrist mean more than injury. I remember the sound of voices that did not belong to Mr. Glenn, people who spoke to each other in the tones hospitals use, the kind that confer urgency and authority. I remember waking later with a nausea and a bright band of sky and being told, softly, that I had been gone. They held a funeral for me. They did not do so with cruelty. In fact, their grief was public and polished and very good at convincing people that it was real. The newspapers ran with the story of a woman loved and lost. Juliet learned the new choreography of loss and became nearer to Arthur in the way a good understudy becomes attached to a role. She learned the words he needed to hear and the cadence he took when he wanted to be soothed. They moved through my things with an efficiency that felt like a tidy erasure. A photograph here, a letter carefully refiled, a name softened on envelopes. The house rearranged itself around the idea that I would not return. I did return, in the blunt way people sometimes return, late, marked, and stubborn. My survival was not a miracle celebrated publicly. It was an anomaly explained away as medical error, as a mistake of identification. The Glens had spoken before I could speak. They had already rewritten the ledger of my life. The bracelet, however, would not be so easily rewritten. The bead left a bruise. Someone had found it. It turned up later, in a dressing room, tucked inside a pair of Juliet's gloves, like an apology or a claim. Waking back into the world after being declared gone is an odd curriculum. You relearn how to be seen. The first thing they asked me when I surfaced was whether I wanted to press charges. The second was whether I wanted a room in some house of recovery that smelled of antiseptic and the blandness of good intentions. My body knew to flinch at hands that guided me now. People looked at me with pity and with the dangerous curiosity of those who feel they must narrate your suffering for themselves. I should have been overwhelmed by gratitude that Arthur had not yet decided to love someone else. That thought feels absurd and small now, but in the immediate aftermath, gratitude felt like a default because survival had been made miraculous by other speeches. Instead of gratitude, I felt a curious thing, a small, surgical anger that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with being erased. I wanted my name back. The vow I made to myself was quiet and procedural. I promised not to be moved by their liturgies of concern. I promised to become my own witness and to collect evidence like a craftsman collects tools. That night, I sat on the edge of a bed that did not feel like mine and wrote lists. The lists used domestic verbs: stitch, fold, file, repair. I wrote down touch points that mattered, things that would not be altered by speeches: the scent of soap on the door jamb, the pattern of the tablecloth in the kitchen drawer, the exact sequence of books on the shelf that Arthur's fingers navigated by habit. I wrote what could be proved: the lapis bead, the bruise pattern on my wrist, a photograph with the wrong caption that now existed in the posthumous articles. It is important to say the word evidence carefully. People imagine evidence as a single shining object, the sort of thing that a detective pulls out at the end of a film to shame the rich and terrible. Real evidence is slowness and tact. It is having a note witnessed. It is a hair in a box with the date on the lid. It is a photograph of a blue bead on velvet with a timestamp. It is chain of custody recorded in plain ink and remembered by someone with nothing to gain but the satisfaction of having been truthful. I began by making the obvious, what I could take without breaking the law or my conscience. I had allies in small places. Maria, who had worked for us as a cleaner for a decade and who had been quietly loyal when loyalty felt like a dangerous thing, agreed to take a photograph with a phone I gave her. She said later that the habit of doing small, discreet favors had been taught to her by my mother: how to make yourself needed without being visible. The picture she took was of something they thought too small to matter, an impression left by my bracelet in the seam of a dressing gown. It was not dramatic. It was a crescent of blue pigment and dented leather. It was proof that the bracelet had been here. There was also a nurse, a woman named Claire, who had once whispered to me about refusing to rubber stamp clinical notes when patients were being shifted to private wings for monitoring. Claire had a conscience that was inconvenient for an empire. She made a copy of a chart for me, only the pages I asked for, and slid it in a packet labeled personal. She did not come forward to the press. She could not afford to, but she understood the law of small favors. She later told me she hated the way the Glens donations looked on hospital letterhead and how they could buy a new wing and never be asked why. When I first met Liam, it was because a hinge in the old study had come loose and the door would not latch. Liam Sterling had a way of measuring a house that made the building seem like a patient in need of steady hands. He was younger than me by a few years, with stubborn juvenile calluses on his fingers and a face that suggested he had slept badly but repaired things anyway. He arrived with a toolbox and an apology for his van, which smelled of oil and lemon wax. We stood in the study while he tested the latch, and I watched how his hands moved, methodical, polite, unshowy. He did not ask why I had been gone. He asked only if I wanted a cup of tea after he finished. There was a helpfulness in him that was not sentimental. There was a steadiness. He had learned to listen before solving, and that is a rarer skill than people assume. He helped me with the practicalities I could not face on my own at first, filling out forms that required signatures and eyes I could not bring myself to meet, moving small things into a safe place. His presence was ordinary in the best way. He was not a hero. He was someone who tightened screws and taught me how to use a hand lens to photograph the lapis bead, a small educational kindness I needed. The first time I spoke to him about the plan, I gave him one sentence. He did not blank. He asked for specifics in the only way that matter, what could be done without harm and within the law. He brought me boxes for storage, a ledger to catalog the objects and the dates I retrieved them. He watched me fold photographs into acid-free paper as if he knew the sanctity of small things. Over time, he became more than a helper. He became the architecture of my life after being made certain of death. Juliet saw us sometimes in the hallways. She always carried flowers, an absurd flourish for a woman who had stepped from mourning into the role of caretaker. Once, in a moment I will not pretend was curious but merely human, she offered me a sunflower and said something like, "It seems right." Her hand trembled when she gave it to me. Her guilt, the thing that made her girlhood beneath the Glen's tutelage wobble, was palpable. She was not broken in the way they would later make her. She was hollowed out by expectation. She smiled to me like a woman who was afraid of her own hands. That smile did not absolve her, but it complicated how I felt about her. I kept records like a small midwife of truth. I photographed the hole the bracelet had left. I saved the soap with its lemon smell. I kept a scrap of Arthur's coat with tobacco faintly embedded in the lining. I wrote transcripts of conversations I remembered. I asked Maria and Claire to sign statements in ink and in presence of witnesses who could attest to when they saw the items. The word chain of custody is dull, and it ought to be. What makes an accusation credible is the mundane drudgery of documentation. When I later presented these things to people who had power, journalists who smelled a story, lawyers who understood what a pattern of removal looked like, they could not dismiss the quiet accumulation of proof. There were nights when the work felt like revenge, and I would tell myself sharply to stop that thought. This was not sport, it was repair. Revenge imagines the quick fall of applause. Repair imagines the long, patient mending of the things that made you whole. I wanted my life back because no one should be redrafted without consent. That moral clarity steadied me when anger wanted to get loud. My aim was accountability, not spectacle for spectacle's sake. Arthur, in all this, remained maddeningly human. He was not a monster I could neatly condemn. He was a man who had been given a new script and then asked to perform it without rehearsal. He loved me badly and well. There were years of tenderness that did not vanish because of the Glen's interventions. He had a cruelty that was not always deliberate, and cowardice that was. Sometimes he would find my hand by habit, and I would feel a grief so acute it felt like hunger. There were days when he would laugh at a story I told, and then turn away because someone had just told him another story that fit better into his new life. Sometimes his voice, when he missed me, broke into small admissions that looked like confessions. He was both harmed and harmful, and that paradox was the hardest thing to hold. I could not reduce him to an object of world-hating. I had to learn how to hold him accountable for choices while recognizing the coercive gravity of his family. The world did what the world often does. It trusted appearances. The Glens held a dinner once, an event thinly disguised as a welcome back to proper living. They invited donors, trustees, and people whose names signaled approval. I went because it would have been suspicious to refuse. Juliet stood beside Arthur looking exactly like what they had planned, the bright, unblemished complement. During the night of the dinner, I found a drawer in Juliet's private dressing room. I had a key only because Maria, loyal in a small way, slipped it into my palm like contraband. The drawer held a pair of gloves and a crumpled tissue, and beneath them, tucked between satin folds, lay my bracelet. It was not on a velvet cushion, simply wrapped in a scarf, as if someone had tried to hide the act of hiding. The bead was scuffed in a way that suggested hurried fingers. There was a hair caught in the clasp, gray at the root, dark at the tip. It could have been Arthur's or someone else's. I photographed it, dated the image, and placed the bracelet in an envelope sealed with tape and witness initials. The act of taking it felt like theft, and in a way it was, but it also felt like taking back a small piece of myself. When you start to gather the threads of a life others have unraveled, you become a kind of archivist of hurt. I learned how to protect the items I collected: acid-free paper, a ledger, witnesses who would sign their names in my presence. I taught myself to tell the story in chronological order so that it would be understood for what it was. Not a melodrama, but a pattern. Patterns are harder to deny than single events. People keep asking me now whether I wanted to punish Arthur. I did not want to punish him. I wanted him to be accountable, to understand the shape of his choices and the consequences that followed, to have his mistakes create repairs rather than further concealments. I wanted the Glens to lose the ability to buy silence. I wanted Juliet to learn what complicity costs, to not let the easy life be a thing without a bill attached. There is a moral logic to restraint that people confuse with mercy. It is not mercy to preserve systems of power in the hopes that good behavior will someday be learned. My aim was justice and the possibility, however remote, of repair. At first, my actions were small and careful. It feels almost tender to say so now. I learned how to become a slow machine of truth. I cataloged, photographed, stored. I sat with Liam over a pot of tea as he taught me to use a macro lens to reveal pigment on a bead. He would sometimes humidify a photograph so the ink softened and the texture read truer. He had the tender patience of someone who makes long-term things with his hands. There were moments we shared in which something like ordinary affection grew. Carrying a box upstairs, making coffee, arguing gently over the right way to label a file. Those moments steadied me in a way more dramatic gestures never could. All the while, the house continued its choreography of replacement. Juliet rehearsed how to laugh quietly in the living room. The Glens hosted neighbors for tea. Arthur rented a room downtown where he could receive guests in privacy. And people who had reason to admire the Glens began to pilfer the old story. She was a good woman, they murmured. Some of them believed they were being kind. Others saw opportunity. I do not tell you this to garner pity. I tell it because the small domestic cruelties are what become law in the court of public opinion. A missing fork becomes a narrative. A changed pillowcase is read as a personality flaw. People who orchestrate erasure know that if they move quietly enough and with the right gentleman's agreement among those who hold prestige, they can remake a life without much interference. Which is why I chose, finally, what seems to be a perverse strategy: to let the public performance happen. I would allow the spectacle of their wedding to proceed, not because I desired humiliation for its own sake, but because stages force witnesses. You cannot control every camera in a room where people are willing to testify. I planned, with a patience that felt like cold water, to use that light as a kind of truth-teller. The decision was a kind of immolation of private relief. I would give up the comfort of a private confrontation for the corrective potential of a public one. It was tactical. A wedding gathers more eyes than a deposition. It creates moments where questions are natural. It forces cohesion to break when it must. There was a cost to this choice. It was my body and my peace I was betting against. I told myself the bet was not for spectacle, but for repair. that the public unmasking of a structure that had been built on my erasure would be more likely to create legal consequences than the embarrassed whispers of house parties. There were nights I lay awake and counted the number of things I would lose if I followed through. I made another list. I wrote down how many sympathetic looks Arthur had, and how many men in ties would stand behind the Glens like trees. I counted the allies I had who could sign statements, and the journalists who owed me favors. I counted the safe houses where I could spend a night if things went poorly. Counting became a way to manage panic. The lists were quiet prayers. The morning I sealed the first packet of evidence and slid it into the back of a small black box, I felt a clarity that was almost merciless. Inside were photographs, the bracelet, a copy of the nurse's chart, Maria's photograph, and a little scrap of Arthur's coat. I wrote the dates in ink and signed my name in a way that felt like claiming territory. I had no illusion that one small box would topple an empire. But things are toppled by accumulations. When I left the house that afternoon, the sun was tilted just so, making the river look like a strip of silver ribbon. Juliet was practicing vows in her head. Arthur was arranging his cluff cuffs by sound. The Glens moved in and out of rooms in tidy choreography. I walked down the street with the box under my arm and went to Liam's shop. He met me at the door with a cup of tea already warm. He did not ask me about the content of the box. He asked only if it had been sealed properly. "Does it matter?" I said. He shrugged, the kind of annoyance that meant affection. "It matters to you," he said, "so it matters." We sat at a small table. Outside, the city kept on living, business as usual, as if grief and survival were merely background textures. Liam put his hand over the box as if to hold it steady. It made me think of the way he had steadied latches and hinges, of his habit of making things hold. That night, as I listened to the city, I felt something old and tender and fierce, a determination that no one would write me out of my story without a signed and witnessed retraction. There is a point in every plan where you move from doing to waiting. Preparation is a kind of choreography, sudden, intense, and then patient. I had reached that pause. I had assembled witnesses and objects. I had enlisted a few small, careful allies. There was more to do. This was only the beginning. But the box on Liam's table felt like the first steady step away from being someone else's footnote. I thought of the sunflowers on the kitchen table and the way they had nodded as if in approval. They were simple things, tending toward the light. In the morning, when the world tried again to claim me as absent, I would step into a crowd and let whatever happened there be the place truth either bled into public light or sank back into private acquiescence. I was tired enough to know that bravery looks like slow work, and brave enough to do it. I had died for a man and been resurrected to choose myself. The box on Liam's table felt heavier than anything that contained paper and metal. Perhaps it was because it held the thin architecture of my life, a bead that knew how my hand fit in sunlight, a scrap of coat that still smelled faintly of tobacco, a photograph that recorded a caption they had changed while I slept. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of the choice. I had decided to let them stage their wedding, and the wedding would be where the slow unspooling either found witnesses or quietly closed the lid forever. I will not pretend the waiting was easy. There is a fear that is not panic, but a persistent pressure, like a band tightened across the diaphragm. Every sound in the house produced a question. Was that a carriage for a guest? A neighbor's laugh? An email ping from a journalist who had understood, finally, that this was not a private sorrow, but a pattern? I learned new kinds of listening. The weight of footsteps on stairs, the cadence of laughter that belonged to people who thought they owned the room. Liam was the opposite of dramatic. He was the person who, in the middle of the night, would go downstairs and glue back a loose shingle on the roof because the sound of it had been keeping me awake. His kindness was utilitarian. It did not declare itself. It showed up as practical measures: an extra bolt on the safe where the evidence was kept, a thermos of tea when I arrived at the small office where we met with a lawyer, a hand at my elbow on the subway when we took the long route to avoid the reporters' usual benches. The lawyer, Eleanor Shaw, had the calculating calm of someone who had argued about property lines and reputations until she learned how reputation itself could be litigated. She accepted the box as if it were a client with a pulse. She taught me how to format statements without offering me a script of revenge. She had a way of asking the right clarifying questions, dates, times, the name of the person who had given witness statements, without making me feel as if my memories were theatrical. We worked in small, procedural increments, the way a restorer treats a painting: clean the surface, catalog the pigments, photograph the damage. Evidence, Eleanor reminded me, was not single and spectacular. It was cumulative. One photograph could be shrugged off as coincidence. A photograph plus a nurse's copy plus a pawnshop testimony made a pattern. She helped me write affidavits that were precise about what had been seen and by whom. We redoubled chain of custody in the most mundane language: dates, witness signatures, where an item had been stored. I felt ridiculous writing down the times I had last seen a mug on a saucer, and yet those details were sometimes the hinge on which a truth swung. There was a pawnshop clerk, a man named Des, who remembered a bracelet with an unusual lapis bead because it matched a photograph in a catalog of oddities he kept behind the counter. He was an unlikely ally. Once, when he was younger, he had been in a neighborhood where the Glens charity had replaced just enough streetlights to make the area feel gentrified and less dangerous. Des had no taste for the Glens. He saw them as people who managed to make kindness a currency. He certified, on paper, inked and dated, that someone had come in a while ago trying to sell a bead-matched bracelet whose description matched mine. He could not, of course, say who had sold it. Pawnshops have curtains of discretion. But his note of the transaction tied with Maria's photograph of the bracelet impression and with the nurse's chart pages that suggested Arthur's appointments had shifted from diagnostic to management. Journalists are theatrical by nature, and I learned to employ their sense of stage to my advantage. Hannah Voss, who wrote for a small but reputable regional paper, had an appetite for patterns. She had a nose for philanthropy stories that masked abuse. She met me at a cafe whose porcelain had promise of being discreet. She read the packets we gave her with a kind of professional hunger that made me feel both exposed and oddly fortified. She did not thirst for scandal. She wanted the truth to be clear and accountable. Once she had enough to feel like she could say something in print without bleeding me dry of privacy, she scheduled a feature that balanced tenderness with indignation. Her editor was cautious. A good editor is cautious for the right reasons. They wanted more corroboration. Eleanor obliged with the slow, deliberate legal language that made reporters trust what they read. There are two ways to break the public silence that protects the powerful: whisper with the effect of thunder, or light a series of small, undeniable bulbs. We chose the bulbs. The morning we decided to move forward, Liam and I went through the evidence in a careful order. Photographs first, then the nurse's copy, then the pawnshop statement, then Maria's testimony, corroborated by witness initials. We made a timeline. We rehearsed, in the way one rehearses for a performance that one hopes will not be pretty, how we would respond if the Glens pushed back. They would push back. Powerful people have playbooks for deflection. Our job was not to outshout them, but to build a ledger that could not be rewritten by a press release. I should say again, because it matters, that Juliet was not a monochrome antagonist in my strategy. She was, in moments, a person who had been taught her lines and then coached to read them with conviction. She also had her own anxieties, her own small cruelties born of learned entitlement. When she offered me a sunflower once, trembling in her hands, I almost accepted it. I thought I could carve out a new kind of relationship that would unmake our enforced roles. I could imagine a version of Juliet who, faced with consequence, would choose to do the harder thing and speak. But that was not how the choreography unfolded. She had been invested in their version of life for reasons that mixed fear, ambition, and the desire to be seen by a family that measured love in spreadsheets and seating charts. In the days before the wedding, everything became measured. I recorded conversations, only the kind that could be ethically recorded in the presence of consent or public event, kept logs of who visited and when, documented sudden changes in Arthur's schedule. I placed small things strategically. A voice note I had saved on a tablet was uploaded to a secure cloud and backed up. A photograph of the bracelet was printed twice and given to 2 independent witnesses. I placed a small, unobtrusive recorder among the sunflowers Juliet insisted on having in the ceremony. It felt like treachery to set a trap, and like prudence to do it. All this sounds mechanical, but there was also the interior life, the grief that threatened to displace strategy with chaos. There were nights when I would wake and think briefly of the river, of being moved like a parcel, of the cold that enters your chest and pushes out everything you thought you would be. Those memories were patient predators. They would show up in the smallest ways: a sound like a distant ambulance, the smell of lemon soap on a passerby whom I would have previously not noticed, the way sunflowers drooped when left too long in hot rooms. Liam would sit with me, offering the steady touch of someone who would not perform rescue, but would lend his hands to steadiness. On the morning of the wedding, the house was a fever of silk and staff. The garden was transformed into a stage. White chairs and perfect arcs, candles and glass cylinders that made the air look as if it could be held. The Glens were deliberate in their generosity. Donors were seated in the front rows, neighbors in the second, relatives in the back. Juliet looked like someone who had practiced joy until it sat on her shoulders without the jitter of fear. Arthur moved through the room with a trust that had been rehearsed into him like a song. He smelled of the aftershave Mr. Glenn favored, tobacco sweetened with citrus, a smell that stitched the family together and made the air in the garden taste of the donor dinners that had raised the family's profile. My place in the garden was at the periphery, an outsider who had decided to make a spectacle of repair. I wore a plain dress. It was not a costume for a dramatic reveal. It was a tool, a way to be present without inviting pity or spectacle. I sat where I could see faces and be seen by the people whose testimonies would matter later. There were cameras, both the kind that lent film to emotion and the kind that lived inside phones, hungry for an angle. I knew these angles were useful. Crowds are witnesses even when they think they are only attending. If you are reading or listening to a story like this, it is easy to believe that the shock is sudden. That belongs in fiction, not in careful dismantling. In a world where power has rehearsed its defenses, collapse is usually a pattern with a beginning, not in a single moment, but in 100 small accuracies. Still, there are moments when the pattern is made visible in public in a way that strips pretense. The altar is one of those architectures. I had asked Hannah to be ready with her reporter's recorder. I had asked a friend from the university press to sit with a tablet and keep a running, time-stamped file. I had asked Maria to sit in the third row with her phone, hand steady, ready to capture the impression she had photographed before. I had told Eleanor to stay outside with a lawyer she trusted in case legal maneuvering became necessary. Each of these people had chosen to be present, and presence matters. The ceremony began with the usual cadences: flute trills, a soft reading about commitment, an officiant who had been selected because he knew how to keep pace with Arthur's hearing and tempo. Juliet approached with a bouquet of sunflowers. They glowed like small suns. Arthur's hand met hers. For a moment, a hush made the garden feel like a sacred place where time could be held. Then the tablet began to buzz in people's pockets as the first journalist received an encrypted message, and screens lifted, and the hush broke into the racket of immediate interest. It was not a single dramatic reveal so much as a tide of small exposures that together made the shore look different. A photograph was passed forward, then another. A voice note played through a phone left on a chair for that purpose. A recording of an appointment reminder from a clinician describing changes in Arthur's care that contradicted public statements. A scanned nurse's chart was shown on a journalist's screen and then mirrored to a dozen people's devices. Maria's photograph of the bracelet impression was printed on 2 small cards and waved discreetly. The crowd looked first puzzled, then uneasy. I saw Arthur's face change before anyone else seemed to register it. For him, recognition came not from a photograph, but from touch and habit. He would close his eyes and make a movement with his fingers, as if reaching for a book he had learned to locate by the creased corner of a page. He made that movement now, as if some small muscle memory had been triggered. A guest near him whispered, Because he had been trained to read the world by sound and touch, the images on screens came to him haltingly, like a voice learning a new accent. But the scent that reached him was immediate: the lemony soap from the photograph, the faint tobacco of the coat scrap. These things had a way of finding him through the senses he trusted. Juliet's face lost its practiced calm in the span of a few breaths. She had learned to inhabit the role of someone whose grief had been deftly managed. She was not prepared for the sensation of being named publicly in a way that suggested complicity rather than innocent replacement. For a second, she looked at me as if to ask how we could be doing this to her. I held her gaze and offered no satisfaction. There was, in that moment, a terrible clarity. My choice had been to allow the performance that made witnesses inevitable. The evidence, once public, would be hard to fold quietly back into the drawing room routine. The response was immediate in the public sense. Phones clicked, murmurs began, and a few people left the chairs and walked away in confusion. Some of the donors in the front rows exchanged glances that read like decisions being made about whether to protect the institution or to insist on inquiry. A trustee rose and, in a voice that managed to be both polite and concerned, said, "We must look into these matters." There were murmurs about optics, but there were also people in that garden whose sympathies shifted with the evidence. Witnesses are not monolithic. They are, at times, pragmatists who will align with truth when the truth is visible. What happened next was quieter than the narrative one expects. Arthur did not scream or lash out. Instead, he became small in a way that was almost childlike. He was unmoored, and that unmooring was not an excuse for violence, but an explanation for confusion. He reached for Juliet's hand and then for mine, fingers finding the sound of my name as if it were a familiar texture. He said my name, a single syllable that felt like it cut through the ceremony like a blade. It was the kind of recognition that has the power to upend a staged life. 2 nights later, after statements had been filed and the papers had started to ask questions, the boathouse became the place where private crisis and public consequence collided. I say this with care and, again, a warning: what follows involves coercion. I will not give lurid detail. I will describe the sequence as needed to understand accountability and consequence. The boathouse belonged to Mr. Glenn originally, an old, paint-peeled structure with the smell of riverweed and varnish. It was a place Arthur had sometimes gone to be alone with the silence of water. The night he came for me, there was no plan for violence in my mind, only the sudden, unpredicted ache of someone who had been unmoored and who reached for the familiar in panic. He wanted us to leave everything behind, to elope in the kind of talk that confuses coercion with romanticism, because the coercer believes love can be a cure. He did not strike me. He was raw and unsteady, begging as if the world could be repaired by a private confession and an escape. He asked me to come with him, to run. He pressed the old habit of his hands to my wrist, as if to locate the position of my pulse. I resisted. Resistance is a quiet architecture: small words, a steady refusal, the movement away. He did not understand that my refusal was not a failure of love. It was the project of love put where it belonged, into a life I would choose again on my terms. I called Liam. I did not call in a melodramatic way. It was one short text: boathouse. He sent a single reply I have kept in my ledger because it felt like a talisman: on my way. On my way. He arrived within minutes, breathless and furious and practical. He was not cinematic in his arrival. He was a man with hands that could close up a door and a voice that could say, clearly, no, not like this. His presence was like that, not rescue in the movie sense, but intervention that upheld a boundary. When the police arrived, because someone on the river had seen a light and called in a report, Arthur did not fight. He was bewildered and desolate. There was a confession of sorts in his eyes, an opening that was not cathartic but honest. He had been manipulated. He had been instructed in a script. He had been made to believe that certain choices were for his well-being. He also knew, in the spaces between breaths, that he had chosen. That is an ugly, necessary truth. Responsibility is not exculpation. In the days that followed, Arthur was charged with false imprisonment and with a lesser count related to the attempt to remove me from my rightful space. The legal language was dry and mechanistic: counts, arraignments, remands. But for those who live the aftermath, legal terms are not abstract. They are the grammar of accountability. He was held to account. He was not promptly villainized. He was treated as someone who had to face both the coercion he had been under and the agency with which he had acted. There were hearings about his competency, requests for therapy reports, and, crucially, a public stipulation that his access to me would be mediated and that any recovery would involve structured therapy and supervised community service. He accepted, not as evasion, but as a material step toward understanding what he had done. The Glens could not contain the fallout. Their board met, donors withdrew, the hospital initiated an inquiry into the way their wing had been named, trustees resigned, as if amiability could erase association. The philanthropic arm announced an audit and, in a gesture meant to signify atonement, pledged funds to independent oversight. These are small things in the history of harm, perhaps, but they are also mechanisms of accountability. They are ways that institutions can be made to pause and to be re-examined. Juliet, when questioned, did not invent a stranger's story. She admitted to knowing more than she had first said. Her admission did not leave her unpunished. She faced social and legal consequences, limits on her involvement in the Glenn family foundations, a small restorative justice program to which she agreed that involved direct work in community organizations, and a requirement to attend therapy and contribute to public panels on privilege and complicity. It was not a theatrical punishment designed to settle scores. It was an attempt at consequence that recognized both culpability and the possibility, however contested, of learning. She lost certain privileges, and with them the safety of anonymity. That loss was not happy. It did, however, remove some of the insulation that had made erasure possible. There is a subtle cruelty in the idea of public spectacle as correction. Public exposure can become its own kind of violence. I was aware of that as the story circulated. I was careful not to use the press as a weapon for humiliation. The aim was to reveal patterns of behavior and to remove the possibility of silence being purchased by money. I wanted the Glens to lose the facility to convert discomfort into a seat at a donor dinner. I wanted systems to be examined. Arthur's path after the arrests was not neat. He began a program of therapy and community supervision. He publicly acknowledged, in a statement mediated by his lawyer, that his choices had hurt people and that he was willing to submit to processes that required him to confront what had been done to him and what he had done to others. He took classes about consent, about coercion, about how power operates in families. None of this absolved him in the eyes of everyone. Some people demanded folding and burning of his entire past. I did not ask for his erasure. I asked for his accountability and for the structures that enabled our erasure to be re-examined. The Glens faced hearings about how their philanthropic influence had been used to bypass scrutiny. There were trustees who had never seen their names in the national press who found themselves having to answer to people they had never before had to explain themselves to. Boards re-examined gift policies, hospitals enforced stricter checks about how clinical recommendations could be influenced by donors. Small institutional corrections were made that would not make the headlines forever, but would create a new architecture for future paces. The most complicated aftermath belonged to Juliet. She attended panels and at times spoke with a voice I could only call raw. She confessed to having been taught that privilege is a shield and that it could be wielded to protect comfortable arrangements. She did not escape unscathed. She did community service. She worked in a shelter where she could see the direct impact of policies that had eroded social safety nets, and she went to therapy. I met her twice more after the legal wave subsided. She apologized without theatrics. I accepted that apology in part and did not pretend it stitched everything that had been unpicked. There are some ragged things that do not mend easily. Meanwhile, my life required the quieter work of rebuilding. I moved out of the old house the Glens had effectively used as an incubator for their plans. People often romanticize the move as a fresh start. It is arduous, slow, and practical. Liam and I found a small flat above his workshop with a window that caught the morning light in a way that made sunflowers possible inside an apartment. We planted a single pot on the sill and tented it. It felt both extravagant and ordinary to watch green unfurl in the city. I began teaching a short class at the community college about archival care and the ethics of documentation. The course was half technical, how to store paper, how to photograph objects so they would hold their detail, and half philosophical, why it matters that the stories of small objects be preserved, and what it means to hold testimony with care. My students were an odd assortment: older volunteers who cataloged local histories, young activists learning how to protect material they gathered in protests, and a retired records manager who had once worked for a small museum. Teaching felt like a vocation of repair, showing others how to make patience into a craft. The photograph of the bracelet found its place in a small, framed case that I kept in my flat. It was not an altar to grievance, it was a lesson plan. I would show it in class sometimes, not as spectacle, but as an example of how a small object can anchor a story and how documentation can create accountability. Students would ask practical questions. How do you document chain of custody? And I would answer with the clear, procedural humility Eleanor had taught me: dates, witnesses, plain ink. I would not teach anyone how to forge or manipulate. I taught them how to make sure the truth could be honored. Liam and I did not become lovers overnight. We walked slowly into what was, for both of us, a new intimacy. Our dates were not cinematic. We hung curtains in the attic, argued over the correct temperature for steeping tea, and shared playlists that made each other laugh at odd, particular notes. We repaired a bookshelf together, and the way our hands found parallel work felt like a kind of conversation. There was a steadiness to our affection that made it less likely to be a furtive rescue and more likely to be a mutual choice. There were moments in the first months when Arthur and I had to negotiate the strange boundaries of a life that had once been intimate and had become a site of public inquiry. I insisted on terms: no private meetings without a mediator, no sudden attempts to reframe the past as if everything had been a misunderstanding. He agreed to a program of therapy that included community service and restitution measures. He came to a panel, under supervision, and spoke, in halting sentences, about his learned dependence on the family script. He read aloud passages that addressed consent and accountability. To my surprise, some things in him seemed to clarify in public testimony. Old habits he had been able to perform in private melted when they were placed under the light of others' scrutiny. Justice, in my experience, was not a tidy cure. Bringing the Glens to account did not resurrect everything they had taken. There were practical losses. No single pledge could answer for lost years or for the small, intimate rituals that had been redirected. But there were also shifts. The hospital expanded its independent oversight committee. A local advocacy group used our case in a campaign to make donor agreements more transparent. Trustees of other foundations began to ask uncomfortable questions. The things I wanted, less about vengeance and more about structural correction, shifted slightly toward possibility. There is a moral labor in refusing vengeance as spectacle. It is not easy. It requires that you keep the distinction between correction and cruelty. I could have, at times, used the press to amplify shame in ways that would be cruel and not just. I chose restraint. That restraint had a cost. I sometimes felt private rage I could not express publicly for fear of perpetuating the very humiliation I wanted to see end. But restraint was also a form of power. It allowed the institutions to be held accountable without turning the story into a carnival. Years, of course, reconfigure things. Arthur's case closed with a mixture of legal penalties and restorative measures. He completed his court-ordered counseling and began to perform service that involved him in educational programs about consent for men in positions of inherited privilege. He volunteered in community centers and later wrote a piece reflecting on the ways he had been encased by his family's influence. Some people forgave him, others did not. I do not ask the world to reconcile inconsistencies it doesn't owe me. I ask only that the systems we witnessed be less able to do the damage they did. Juliet's progress was erratic. Sometimes she floundered, sometimes she made meaningful, if small, contributions to community work. The law exacts a kind of blunt accountability. Restorative processes asked her to work directly with those harmed by systems of power. She did that in uncomfortable, prosaic ways, teaching, handing out food, sitting through long counseling sessions in which she had to listen and be titled not as a beneficiary, but as someone who had been helped by systems she had supported. As for me, the slow work of living, making tea, teaching, repairing chairs, has been smaller and truer than the drama of litigation. Love with Liam grew as something that tended toward the domestic. He cut a piece of wood for a shelf and sanded it because he knew I liked the grain to be visible. I made a pot of soup that he insisted was the right thickness. We argued about podcasts and politics, and then we made up by reading aloud to one another from books that neither of us could bear to finish alone. The photo of the bracelet sits in a case in my flat window. Sunlight hits it in the late afternoon, and the lapis bead in the print catches blue. Sometimes, when I am grading essays or preparing a lecture, my hand will go to that image, as if to check that the thing is still faithfully preserved. It is both an artifact and a promise, an insistence that my life was not disposable. People ask whether I regret letting them stage the wedding. It is a fair question. There were nights, late, unglued nights, when I wondered about the personal cost. Letting the public replacement occur required me to tolerate temporary humiliation and the seeing of my life being performed without me. It hurt. It still hurts in the way old scars ache before rain. But tactically, the wedding forced witnesses and made plausible deniability harder to sustain. Allowing Juliet to take my place in the way the Glens wanted was not an act of submission born of cowardice. It was a strategic restraint. I declined to rescue my story in a private room because that would have allowed the Glens to continue their pattern in private spaces. In choosing the wedding as stage, I chose to let the false heiress take my place in his heart publicly, if only for a moment. That allowed us to gather witnesses who could not easily be persuaded to forget. I allowed a role to be inhabited in order not to surrender the possibility of public truth. It is a complicated moral shape, and I hold its edges with care. I was reborn out of a near erasure and used that rebirth to insist on accountability rather than on revenge. The title of this story is not a boast, it is a confession of method. There are small, domestic joys that feel like victories precisely because they are ordinary. The sunflowers in the window face light, and we water them on schedule. Liam and I spend Sunday mornings fixing things we imagine have outlived usefulness. I teach a class once a term that fills with people whose curiosity about truth is practical. I keep the photograph of the bracelet for the students and for myself. It is a witness. When I think of Arthur now, I do so with a complicated tenderness. He is a man who needs to be accountable for what he did. He is also a man who was formed in a household that taught its people to solve discomfort through substitution. I do not see the story as one that requires his annihilation. I see it as one that requires his sustained attention to the harm his choices caused and to the structures that enabled them. He has taken steps, public and private, that have the shape of repair rather than denial. That is not a tidy redemption arc. It is a painstaking, day-by-day work. Juliet's life after the exposure is not a collapse into ruin, nor a seamless redemption. She lost privileges, and she also learned, painfully, what her complicity had cost. She engaged in work that made her name less useful and made her actions more visible. That is a kind of justice that is not punitive spectacle, but practical consequence. My final act in the longer arc of this life was to reclaim authorship of my days. I declined, in quiet moments, to rehearse old loyalties that had the power to erase me. I kept my ledger. I taught my students how to be careful with objects. I planted sunflowers on a sill in the city and watched them lean toward the light. I loved someone who could tighten a hinge and brew tea without ceremony. I forgave myself for the naivete of past years without letting that forgiveness mean forgetting. If you have stayed with this story, thank you. There is no clean ending in many of these narratives, only ongoing accounting, repairs, and the daily decision to keep living on one's terms. If this has resonated, subscribe to hear more stories about what it means to repair a life. Come back if you want to learn how small objects hold large truths and how patient labor can become justice. I died once for a man who could not then see me. I woke and chose, with intention and evidence, not only to be seen, but to insist that the structures that had erased me be examined. I allowed the replacement they preferred to be staged so that the world would have a chance to watch the undoing. That strategic restraint was not an abdication. It was a way of reclaiming the plot of my life. In the aftermath, I learned that repair is not a spectacle, but a craft. It requires hands that can stitch, eyes that can document, and people who can sit with you while you learn to be a person again. The bracelet remains in its case. Sometimes, late at night, Liam and I will put our hands on the glass as if cupping a small secret. And we will remember that what was lost was not merely an object, but an occasion to be reborn into the committed labor of living. The sunflowers nod by the window, and I tend them because tending is a verb that proves existence. The choice to let the false heiress stand for a time in the place they had arranged for me was a gambit. It paid not in trophies, but in witnesses, in changes to institutions, and in the quiet, daily work of a life rebuilt. I died loving a blind man. I woke and chose myself.